Have you ever felt that absolute dread of a sudden steep rent hike? Now, imagine that hike isn't just a few bucks, it's upwards of 100%. Yeah, ouch. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a situation that literally exploded across headlines in early May 2026, Ghana's nationwide student housing crisis, and a really aggressive crackdown launched by the Rent Control Department. It's a wild story of skyrocketing rents, government decrees, and a massive shortfall in housing that honestly affects anyone paying rent anywhere. To understand what is really going on behind this media blitz, we are relying exclusively on a comprehensive, incredibly detailed analysis published by the Property Economist. Okay, let's dive right into this. So here's our roadmap for today based on the journal's analysis. We'll look at the May 2026 rent crackdown, compare legal mandates versus reality, dive into the economics of rent control, expose the true housing deficit, and finally, look at fixing the supply crisis. Section 1. The May 2026 rent crackdown, a media blitz and high rents. So back in early May, Acting Rent Commissioner Frederick Opoku sparked an absolute firestorm. He made this startling public decree announcing, by law, no agents are permitted to mediate in the search for accommodation. And he didn't stop there. The department actually threatened sweeping hostel shutdowns. Now, to be completely fair here, the grievances behind these announcements, they're very real. Students and urban workers are hurting right now. Over the past 5 years, we've seen rents in Accra shoot up 80 to 120% in real terms. That's largely because the cedi lost over half its value against the US dollar, plus you've got massive construction cost inflation. The frustration makes total sense. But the journal's analysis asks a really critical question. Does the department actually have the legal authority to execute these sweeping threats? Which brings us to Section 2, legal mandates versus reality, what the law actually says. The Rent Control Department has been publicly claiming they can just shut down unregistered or overpriced hostels. But looking at the Property Economist's legal analysis, there is a massive catch. Under the Rent Act of 1963, also known as Act 220, sure, the department can certify rents and mediate disputes, but under Section 17 of that exact same act, they actually need a magistrate's enforcement order to take compulsory action, meaning they don't have the unilateral power to just go around padlocking gates like some health inspector closing down a bad restaurant. The analysis points out that executing these closures without a judge's permission leaves the state highly, highly vulnerable to judicial pushback. And what about that blanket ban on accommodation agents? Well, this is where things get really surprising. The Real Estate Agency Act of 2020, Act 1047, was literally created to regulate and license these exact agents. The law makes unlicensed practice an offense, not the practice itself. The analysis clarifies that what the 1963 Rent Act actually prohibits is key money. You know, that illegal extortion-style premium demanded just to grant a tenancy. According to the journal, conflating a ban on key money with a blanket ban on legitimate licensed agents misrepresents the law, and it completely ignores constitutional guarantees to freedom of trade. Moving to Section 3, the economics of rent control. Good intentions, bad outcomes. Here is a rare area where economists actually seem to agree on something. The source highlights a fascinating and frankly concerning statistic. Roughly 70% of economists warn that rent ceilings actively reduce housing quality and quantity over time. According to the analysis, this is actually one of the most settled debates in applied economics. Even a 2021 IMF housing market review echoed this exact sentiment. They showed that hard rent ceilings consistently destroy housing supply, and ironically, they disproportionately harm the newest people entering the market, like you guessed it, young university students. Think of it like a rational economic domino effect. Put yourself in the shoes of a hostel operator for a second. The government suddenly caps your rental income, but you're still dealing with soaring borrowing rates and massive inflation on stuff like cement and building materials. You simply can't cover your costs. So instead of just taking a huge financial loss year after year, operators take the rational next step. They exit the market. They either close down completely or they repurpose those student buildings into commercial offices or maybe short-term vacation lets. And the ultimate result of all this? The supply of student beds shrinks drastically. That only intensifies competition and drives market prices even higher for the few beds that are actually left. To ground this theory in some hard evidence, the Property Economist cites a landmark 2019 study published in the American Economic Review. Get this, when San Francisco expanded its strict rent controls, the total rental supply in those specific areas fell by 15% within just 5 years. Landlords simply took units off the market. It's a classic, tragic case of a policy harming the exact vulnerable group it was designed to protect in the first place. As the journal notes, good intentions just don't always equal good economics. Section 4. The true housing deficit. 30 years of underinvestment. Now, this is where the Property Economist reveals a major twist in the story. They argue that the government is aggressively regulating the private sector to deflect from its own 3-decade failure to build housing. And the data here is absolutely staggering. Between 2000 and 2023, public university enrollment in Ghana surged by 250%. Yet over that exact same period, government-funded dormitory beds grew by less than 40%. Look at the University of Ghana, Legon, for example. On-campus accommodation can house roughly 9,000 students, but enrollment, it exceeds 40,000. It's a massive structural shortfall that has literally been brewing for decades. Which brings us to a genuinely shocking number: 0. In Ghana's 2024 national budget, there was absolutely zero dedicated allocation for public housing construction. Nothing. The journal highlights that over the years, multiple state housing projects have stalled entirely, mostly due to funding shortfalls and endless procurement disputes. Because of this, the Property Economist makes a very pointed argument. They state, the private hostel sector filled the gap the government refused to fill. Private developers and communities surrounding Legon and KNUST basically built tens of thousands of hostel beds straight out of their own pockets. The journal suggests that threatening and penalizing these very same developers for high prices is essentially treating the symptom while completely ignoring the underlying disease: zero public supply. Section 5. Fixing the supply crisis. Evidence-based interventions. So how do we actually fix this? Well, the journal proposes a fascinating 5-point policy toolkit designed to stimulate purpose-built supply while genuinely protecting tenants. This toolkit includes supply-side reform, second-generation rent stabilization, public-private partnerships for student housing, professionalizing the agency sector instead of just trying to ban it, and finally, passing a modern Residential Tenancies Act to replace that totally obsolete 1963 law. And we don't even have to guess if these ideas work, because the analysis points directly to global success stories. Take supply-side reform, for example. Rwanda successfully reduced construction permit timelines to under 25 days, making it significantly easier and cheaper to build. For rent stabilization, Germany uses a model called the Mietpreisbremse. This limits the rate of rent increases in high-demand areas, but, and this is key, it entirely exempts newly constructed properties. That ensures developers still have a huge incentive to keep building. And for public-private partnerships, South Africa has successfully used concession models where private developers build and operate residences on university land without requiring any upfront government capital. Ultimately, the Property Economist's cross-cutting conclusion is crystal clear. The government simply has to accept its share of responsibility. The publication argues that no policy intervention will succeed if it is used merely as a substitute for public investment. Future national budgets must include dedicated allocations to complement rather than attack private investment. I want to leave you with this final, provocative question raised by today's analysis to ponder. Can regulation ever cure a crisis created by a lack of supply? Can politically appealing crackdowns and press conferences truly substitute for actually building houses? It's a fascinating look at the intersection of law, economics, and real estate. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep asking the big questions.